It was the largest warplane in the world at the time, an awe-inspiring behemoth of aluminum and steel with a wingspan stretching 230 feet. High above, it droned on 6 giant piston engines, and later, for jet engines as well, leaving contrails in the stratosphere and a rumble in its wake. This was the Convair B-36 Peacemaker, a strategic bomber of unprecedented scale. Conceived in the crucible of World War II and entering service as the Cold War began, the B-36 would stand for a decade as one of the pillars of America's nuclear deterrent. The story of the Peacemaker is one of superlatives: biggest, longest ranged, highest flying, and it unfolds against the backdrop of an anxious era when the threat of global conflict loomed and technological daring shaped the balance of power. In early 1941, as war raged across Europe, American military planners faced the grim prospect of a world without friendly bases. Nazi Germany's forces threatened to overrun Britain, and the United States had not yet entered the conflict. In this tense atmosphere, the United States Army Air Corps quietly began formulating requirements for an unprecedented aircraft, a bomber capable of flying across the Atlantic Ocean from North America to strike targets deep in enemy territory and then return home without refueling. It was an audacious idea born of necessity. If Great Britain fell to the Axis, America might stand alone, yet still needed a way to carry the fight to a distant foe. Only an intercontinental bomber, something far beyond the range of any existing aircraft, could fulfill that mission. Military planners drew up ambitious specifications for this bomber in April 1941. They imagined a behemoth with extraordinary performance, a top speed around 450 miles per hour, a cruising speed near 275 miles per hour, an operational ceiling up to 45,000 feet to soar above anti-aircraft fire, and a staggering range of 12,000 miles. Most crucially, it had to carry a sizable bomb load of at least 10,000 pounds over a combat radius of 5,000 miles, meaning it should be able to fly 5,000 miles out to a target and then 5,000 miles back. At that time, no aircraft in existence came close to these requirements. The famous Boeing B-17 and consolidated B-24 heavy bombers of the day had nowhere near that range, and even the next-generation Boeing B-29 Superfortress then under development would not meet such extreme distances unrefueled. The proposal seemed almost fantastical, pushing the limits of aeronautical technology. In fact, the initial requirements proved far too demanding for the technology of 1941. At the same time, Nazi Germany had sketched a similar requirement, the so-called America bomber, to reach the United States from Europe, but that project never progressed beyond prototypes. Within a few months, the Air Corps scaled back its expectations. By August 1941, the target performance was revised to a maximum range of about 10,000 miles, with a combat radius of roughly 4,000 miles carrying 10,000 pounds of bombs, a cruise speed between 240 and 300 miles per hour, and a service ceiling of roughly 40,000 feet. Even these moderated figures represented a giant leap beyond anything flying at the time, but they were deemed just within the realm of possibility. Several American aircraft manufacturers took up the challenge and began drafting concepts to meet this ultra-long-range bomber need. Among them was Consolidated Aircraft, a company already known for producing the B-24 Liberator bomber. Consolidated's design team, working out of San Diego, devised an enormous aircraft concept designated as Model 36. This design was unlike any bomber ever built. It would have a colossal wingspan of 230 feet, nearly the length of a football field, and be capable of cruising at high altitude beyond the reach of most fighters and flak. The proposed bomber would carry its bomb load to the target while flying at around 300 miles per hour and at an altitude of 40,000 feet. The Army Air Corps was impressed by Consolidated's bold proposal, which promised the ability to strike enemies across oceans. On November 15, 1941, just weeks before the United States entered World War II, the Army Air Corps placed an order with Consolidated to build 2 prototypes of the bomber. At this early stage, the aircraft existed only on paper, but it represented a major step toward realizing an intercontinental strike capability. However, global events soon overtook the project's timeline. Less than a month after the prototype order, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, thrust the United States into World War II. The nation suddenly faced a two-ocean war against formidable adversaries in both Europe and the Pacific. In the urgent wartime mobilization that followed, immediate priorities shifted to proven designs that could be mass-produced quickly. Consolidated Aircraft, like other manufacturers, had to focus on aircraft already in service or nearly ready, such as the B-24 Liberator, which was needed in great numbers. The development of the new intercontinental bomber was pushed to the back burner. Resources and engineering attention that might have gone to the bomber were instead directed to building thousands of existing bombers and patrol planes required for the war effort. Although delayed, the bomber project was not forgotten. The United States and its allies managed to gain the upper hand in Europe using heavy bombers based in England to strike Nazi Germany, and in the Pacific using the long-range B-29 based in forward areas to strike Japan. But in the early years of the war, the outcome was far from certain. American planners still saw value in a truly intercontinental bomber as an insurance policy. In mid-1942 and 1943, concerns shifted to the Pacific theater. Capturing and holding bases within range of Japan proved difficult and costly, and an aircraft that could operate from Hawaii or Alaska to hit targets in Japan became highly desirable. In July 1943, with World War II raging on multiple fronts, the Army Air Forces, as the Air Corps had been renamed, took the bold step of issuing a letter of intent for an initial production run of the new bomber, even though the prototype had not yet flown. By that time, Consolidated Aircraft had merged with Vultee to form Convair, Consolidated Vultee Aircraft Corporation, but it was essentially the same team working on the bomber. The military's letter of intent in 1943 called for 100 production aircraft to be delivered as soon as possible, with optimistic plans to have the first delivered by late 1945. This unusual move underscored just how critical high-level planners considered the intercontinental bomber concept for future strategy. Design and construction of the prototype progressed slowly during the war years, hampered by the pressing needs of higher priority programs. The giant bomber's sheer size and novel features posed engineering challenges that had to be solved largely through trial and error. One early issue was the landing gear. The aircraft's projected weight was so great that no standard landing gear would suffice. The initial prototype design featured a massive single-wheel main landing gear under each wing. Each of these single tires was over 9 feet tall and more than 3 feet wide, the largest aircraft tires ever manufactured up to that time. They were so large and heavy that they could potentially damage runways due to the extreme ground pressure. Engineers even experimented with an extraordinary alternative, a tracked landing gear assembly, almost like a small tank tread, that could spread the weight over a larger surface area. This tracked gear was tested briefly, but it proved impractical. It was heavy, complex, and created tremendous noise and vibration. In the end, the single gigantic wheels were also deemed unsuitable for general use, and the solution was to design a 4-wheel bogie for each main landing gear leg, distributing the weight over 4 tires instead of 1. This multi-wheel gear design would become standard on the production models, allowing the huge bomber to operate from standard airfields that had sufficiently long runways. Another challenge was manufacturing and assembly of an aircraft of unprecedented scale. During the war, Consolidated Convair relocated the center of its bomber development to Fort Worth, Texas. This move was partly motivated by wartime concerns about protecting critical manufacturing from coastal threats and partly to expand production capacity. The relocation caused further delays as equipment and personnel were transferred. Additionally, in the midst of developing the bomber, the company was tasked with adapting the basic airframe into a transport plane as well, a project that eventually led to the single prototype of the Convair XC-99, a massive cargo aircraft derived from the bomber's design. Balancing these side projects and the main bomber development stretched the company's engineering resources thin during the wartime period. As the war in Europe continued, American and British strategic bombers hammered German targets from bases in England, and ultimately the need to fly combat missions from North America to Europe never materialized, because Britain did not fall. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the capture of islands like Saipan and Tinian allowed the United States to use the B-29 Superfortress to strike Japan directly, bringing the Pacific War to a climax with conventional and atomic bombing in 1945. Ironically, the new intercontinental bomber was running behind schedule for the very war it had been conceived to win. By the time the first prototype was finally nearing completion in mid-1945, the world conflict was nearly over. The first prototype, designated XB-36, was unveiled on August 20, 1945, just days after Japan's surrender ended World War II. It was an immense silver aircraft with a distinctly imposing presence, so large that its nose landing gear had to be extended to an extreme height just to raise the gigantic tail enough to clear the hangar doors during the rollout ceremony. Workers literally jacked up the nose to angle the aircraft, illustrating how unprecedented its dimensions were. The tail fin alone was so tall that existing hangars could barely accommodate it. Although World War II ended before the bomber could contribute, the international situation evolved almost immediately into a new kind of standoff. The victorious United States soon faced a former ally turned potential adversary, the Soviet Union. In the power vacuum and realignments following the war, Tensions mounted as the Soviets expanded their influence in Eastern Europe and beyond. The spring of 1946 became a replay of 1941 in some respects, with a hostile dictator, Joseph Stalin, swallowing pieces of Europe and the Americans initially unable to do much about it. The strategic card, the threat of wholesale destruction by nuclear weapons, seemed the only one that a demobilized, budget-cutting United States could play. The giant bomber now had a new raison d'etre, to serve as a deterrent and a potential strategic weapon against the Soviet Union in what was shaping up to be the Cold War. The rapid demobilization after World War II had initially put the future of the B-36 in doubt, but the emerging Soviet threat convinced US leaders to press forward. Initial plans for 100 of the bombers were adjusted, and though some production was deferred, the program was soon back on track, with even larger numbers envisioned as tensions rose. Testing of the XB-36 prototype proceeded in this uncertain post-war climate. On August 8, 1946, Convair test pilot Beryl Erickson took the XB-36 up for its maiden flight at Fort Worth's airfield. A few Convair crew members accompanied him to monitor instruments. The 6 engines roared as the huge Silver Bird lumbered down the runway, slowly gaining speed. After a very long takeoff roll, the prototype finally rose into the air, becoming the largest and heaviest land-based airplane ever to fly at that time. Observers on the ground cheered as the giant bomber climbed out, and after about 30 minutes of stable flight testing in the vicinity, Erickson gently brought the XB-36 back for landing. It was a smooth touchdown, conclusively demonstrating that this radical aircraft was viable. The successful maiden flight validated years of design work and gave engineers valuable data for further improvements. The prototype's performance was encouraging in some respects. It managed to fly at high altitude and long range as intended, but it also revealed many areas that needed improvement. The aircraft was underpowered in its initial configuration, and some systems were not yet reliable. However, the fundamental concept was proven. An intercontinental bomber was indeed feasible. By the late 1940s, the geopolitical landscape had changed dramatically from the world of 1941 when the B-36 was conceived. The United States Air Force became an independent service in 1947, separating from the Army, and it inherited the nation's strategic bombing mission. Within the new Air Force, a Strategic Air Command, SAC, was established to focus on long-range nuclear strike capabilities, while Tactical Air Command concentrated on shorter-range support missions. Strategic Air Command, led after 1948 by General Curtis LeMay, took charge of the emerging fleet of strategic bombers including the new Convair bomber, which had by now been officially designated the B-36 and given the nickname Peacemaker. The choice of name reflected the post-war philosophy that having a powerful offensive weapon could help prevent war through deterrence. It was a colossal aircraft intended to keep the peace by virtue of the threat it posed to any aggressor. Even before the first B-36 became operational, world events pressed American leaders to demonstrate their strategic reach. In 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded the western sectors of Berlin, leading to the Berlin airlift crisis. Though the immediate American response was an airlift of supplies into the city using cargo planes, the blockade underscored the growing East-West confrontation. In that same period, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, shattering the US monopoly on nuclear weapons. The early Cold War was underway, and Strategic Air Command desperately needed a way to project nuclear firepower across the globe. At that moment, the B-29 Superfortress bombers left over from World War II were the only means of delivering atomic bombs, but their range was limited. Only a specially modified group of B-29s, the Silverplate B-29s, could carry the first generation of atomic weapons, and those had to be relatively close to targets or rely on overseas bases. The B-36 Peacemaker promised to change that calculus entirely. Convair delivered the first production B-36A to the Air Force in mid-1948. This aircraft was assigned to the 7th Bomb Group at Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, conveniently located adjacent to the Convair factory where it was built. Seeing the B-36A up close drove home just how enormous it was compared to the previous generation of bombers. Airmen marveled that a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the heavyweight champion of World War II, could practically fit underneath one wing of a B-36. The B-36 dwarfed everything that had come before. It stretched approximately 162 feet from nose to tail and stood nearly 47 feet tall at the tip of its massive vertical tail. Its fuselage was long and slender, akin to a giant silver cigar, with a round cross-section to allow pressurization. The most arresting feature was its wing, a gigantic high aspect ratio wing that spanned 230 feet and covered such a large area that the bomber almost looked like a flying wing with a fuselage attached. The wing roots were more than 7 feet thick, over 2 meters, enough to allow a crewman to literally crawl inside the wing. In fact, a tunnel ran through each wing, enabling crew access to the engines or the landing gear in flight if necessary. Technicians could use a wheel trolley and pull on a rope inside the wing to haul themselves along the span, although such in-flight maintenance was only attempted at lower altitudes when conditions permitted. Perhaps the most unusual aspect of the B-36 design was its propulsion. The B-36 was powered by 6 Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp major radial engines, each a massive 28-cylinder 4-row piston engine. These engines were mounted not in the nose of the wing as on typical propeller-driven aircraft, but rather in a pusher configuration, meaning the engines were installed with their propellers facing backwards, pushing the aircraft through the air from behind the wing's trailing edge. The pusher layout had been chosen to reduce aerodynamic turbulence over the wing and to allow the use of very large propellers. Each of the 6 3-bladed propellers was 19 feet in diameter. To prevent the propeller tips from reaching supersonic speeds at high rotation, which would cause inefficiency and structural stress, the propellers were geared to turn at about half the speed of the engines. When the B-36 flew overhead, these slow-turning giant propellers, driven by the powerful radial engines, produced a distinctive low-frequency drone. People on the ground who experienced a B-36 passing above often described the sound as unforgettable, a deep, resonant vibration that could rattle windows even when the aircraft was cruising miles overhead at high altitude. At the very front of the aircraft, a broad plexiglass canopy enclosed the cockpit, giving the pilots a panoramic view. Below, it sat a bulbous chin radome for targeting radar, and on either side of the nose were transparent blisters that crew members could use to visually aim guns or observe any mechanical issues. These features lent the B-36 a distinctive front profile. Some said the nose resembled a giant creature's face, with the canopy as its eyes and the blisters as its ears. Enormous as the B-36 was, its designers did not use power-assisted controls. Instead, the pilot's control inputs moved small trim tabs on the trailing edges of its huge ailerons and tail surfaces, and those trim tabs aerodynamically steered the larger surfaces. This arrangement allowed the crew to maneuver the giant bomber in flight without hydraulic boosters, although flying such a behemoth still demanded considerable strength and skill from the pilots. The B-36's gargantuan size did not mean its crew rode in great comfort. In fact, space was at a premium inside. To allow the aircraft to fly long durations at high altitudes, the designers provided pressurized compartments for the crew, similar in concept to what the B-29 had introduced. The forward section of the fuselage contained a pressurized flight deck and nose compartment for pilots and other flight crew such as the navigator, bombardier, radioman, and forward gunners. Aft of the bomb bays, another pressurized compartment in the rear fuselage accommodated additional crew, including tail gunners and relief crew members. A pressurized tunnel, just 2 feet in diameter and stretching some 85 feet, ran above the bomb bays to connect the forward and aft sections. Crew members could lie supine on a wheeled trolley and pull themselves along an overhead rope through this tube to transit between the front and rear compartments. It was a unique solution to allow movement inside an aircraft of this length while keeping it pressurized. The standard crew complement on the early B-36 was 15. On a typical mission, this included a pilot and co-pilot, 2 flight engineers to monitor the complex engines and systems. Each of the 6 corncob radial engines had 28 cylinders and a total of 56 spark plugs, amounting to 336 spark plugs across the plane, which frequently required inspection and replacement, a navigator, a bombardier, radio operators, and several gunners for the defensive turrets. In the forward cabin, up to 10 crew could be stationed, while the aft compartment could hold 5 or more, with provisions for rest. The rear compartment of the B-36 was outfitted with 6 bunk beds so that crew could sleep in shifts on very long missions. Still, rest could be elusive with the thunderous vibration of 6 engines permeating the airframe. Crew members wore headphones to dampen the sound and to communicate via intercom. The B-36 droned incessantly through its long flights, a constant sonic backdrop that tested the endurance of everyone on board. There was even an electric galley with a hot plate for preparing meals, since missions could last well over a day. A small chemical toilet and a primitive urinal were provided, the latter reportedly being a tiny receptacle that had to be emptied overboard periodically. Anecdotes from B-36 crewmen highlight how the creature comforts were minimal. One oft-told story involves a new captain who failed to follow the proper procedure for using the relief tube and accidentally fouled his boots, much to the amusement of the veteran crew. The living conditions on a B-36 were cramped and Spartan despite the aircraft's giant exterior dimensions. When a full crew of 15 was aboard for 24 hours or more, the pressurized cabins could feel quite crowded. A B-36 carried its bomb payload in two cavernous bomb bays located in the belly of the fuselage between the front and rear pressurized sections. These bays were large enough to hold the biggest weapons of the day. The aircraft was designed from the outset to carry nuclear ordnance, which in the late 1940s meant large, bulky atomic bombs like the ones developed during World War II. It could also carry a huge load of conventional bombs, up to 86,000 pounds in total, far exceeding the load of any previous bomber. However, the first production model, the B-36A, was not yet truly combat ready. These initial airplanes, delivered in 1948 and 1949, were mainly used for training and familiarization. They lacked defensive armament because the complex remotely operated gun turrets were not fully developed in time. Essentially, the early B-36s served as stepping stones. They allowed the Air Force to train crews and work out operational procedures while later, more capable versions were in the pipeline. All 22 of the B-36A models built were eventually converted to RB-36E reconnaissance aircraft, or used for testing once later bomber variants became available. By late 1948, the improved B-36B variant began to roll out to Strategic Air Command units. The B-36B was considered the first fully combat-capable version of the Peacemaker. It addressed some of the shortcomings of the initial model. Most importantly, it was finally armed with an array of defensive weapons. The B-36B sported 6 remote-controlled gun turrets distributed across its fuselage. These turrets, when not in use, could retract flush into the aircraft's skin, and when deployed they appeared like blisters popping out along the top and bottom. Each retractable turret housed a pair of 20mm cannon to defend against enemy fighters. In addition, the B-36B had fixed forward-firing 20mm cannon in the nose and a similar pair of cannon in the tail, giving it heavy defensive firepower at both ends. Crew members operated these weapons via periscopic sights and optical targeting blisters, aiming the guns remotely from protected positions. Even with these additions, operating such a large plane in combat would have been a daunting task. The B-36B also featured improvements to its engines and avionics for better performance and reliability, since the early models had revealed issues like engine overheating at high altitudes and difficulties with maintenance. As Strategic Air Command worked up its new bomber force, it was under the firm leadership of General Curtis LeMay, an experienced World War II bomber commander determined to make SAC a credible deterrent. In 1948, LeMay took charge of SAC and was dismayed at the state of readiness and training he found. He immediately imposed rigorous drills and realistic training missions to sharpen his crews. In one famous exercise, he ordered a simulated bombing raid on Dayton, Ohio, from high altitude, only to see many crews struggle to hit the target using outdated maps and techniques. After this sobering fiasco, LeMay set about radically improving SAC's performance. He imposed stringent training standards and reshuffled personnel, moving the most skilled crews and leaders into key positions. The elite 509th Bomb Group, famous for its World War II atomic missions, was the first to be made fully combat-ready, and LeMay then applied the same high standards across other units in turn, rapidly transforming SAC into a crack force. By the fall of 1948, an improved B-36B had arrived, armed and ready as described. On December 7, 1948, the 7th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, a B-36 crew led by Lieutenant Colonel John Bartlett took off from Carswell AFB in Texas, flew a marathon mission to Hawaii, dropped a 10,000-pound dummy bomb near Honolulu, and then returned non-stop to the mainland. The entire mission spanned about 35 hours and demonstrated that the United States now possessed an aircraft that could reach out to the mid-Pacific from deep inside the continental US without refueling or staging. What made this feat more impressive was that the giant bomber went essentially undetected by Hawaiian air defenses during the mock attack run. General LeMay must have been pleased with the news. If a B-36 could reach Hawaii from Texas, it meant one could potentially hit the Soviet Union from bases in Maine or the Aleutian Islands. And if SAC could figure out how to operate the B-36 in the cold of the Arctic, all of Siberia would fall under its shadow. The B-36B also incorporated modifications to carry the first generation of thermonuclear weapons. In the early 1950s, the United States was developing hydrogen bombs, which were significantly larger and heavier than the first atomic bombs. One such weapon, the Mk-17 hydrogen bomb, was about 25 feet long and weighed roughly 42,000 pounds. The B-36 bomb bays were adapted under a program nicknamed Grand Slam to accommodate these massive bombs. Earlier B-36A models had not been built with knowledge of the final dimensions of these weapons. The H-bomb program was so secret that Convair hadn't been given the exact specifications in time, but by the B-36B production run, the necessary adjustments were made. This enabled the Peacemaker to carry and deliver the most powerful explosives of the era. While the Air Force was embracing the B-36, skepticism and rivalry brewed in other corners of the U.S. military. The U.S. Navy, in particular, was alarmed by the Air Force's focus on long-range strategic bombers as the primary means of delivering nuclear weapons. Traditionally, the Navy had seen itself as a key strategic force through its carrier aviation and envisioned deploying its own nuclear strikes via carrier-launched aircraft. In 1949, these inter-service tensions erupted into a public controversy famously known as the Revolt of the Admirals. The catalyst was the Defense Department's decision, under Secretary of Defense Louis Johnson, to cancel a planned 65,000-ton supercarrier, the USS United States, that would have been capable of launching large, nuclear-capable naval bombers. The funds and strategic emphasis were being given instead to the Air Force's B-36 program. Some Navy supporters began attacking the B-36 credibility and even the integrity of its procurement. In this heated climate, a memorandum written by Cedric Worth, a Navy Department official, circulated allegations that the B-36 program was a colossal mistake and possibly tainted by corruption. The memo condemned the B-36 as obsolete and unsuccessful, and insinuated that Convair had secured the bomber contract through improper political influence, even alleging bribes to officials. The Navy's allies labeled the B-36 a billion-dollar blunder and derided it as a lumbering cow, too slow and vulnerable, they said, to survive against modern jet fighters. Some went so far as to claim that existing Navy jet fighters could easily intercept and shoot down a B-36 at altitude. The Air Force stanchly defended its prize bomber. It arranged demonstrations showing that contemporary fighters struggled to even reach the B-36 at its operational ceiling, let alone intercept it effectively. In one test, a B-36 flying at 40,000 feet was essentially immune as U.S. Air Force fighters of the day, like the F-80, F-84, and even the newer F-86 Sabre, took so long to climb to that altitude that they had minimal fuel or maneuvering capability once they got there. When the fighters did reach the B-36 height, their high wing loading meant they could barely turn without stalling in the thin air, whereas the B-36 with its enormous wing could still make gentle evasive maneuvers. The Navy's challenge to stage a realistic interception test was ultimately dropped. The controversy escalated to the point that Congress held hearings in 1949 to investigate the competing claims and the broader issue of roles and missions in national defense. During dramatic proceedings, Cedric Worth was revealed as the author of the anonymous memo and was forced to recant his accusations. A congressional committee eventually cleared the Air Force and Convair of any wrongdoing in the B-36 procurement. In the glow of this vindication, Air Force leaders touted the Peacemaker's strategic value with even greater zeal. Stuart Symington, the Secretary of the Air Force, stated confidently that the B-36 could take off from bases on this continent, penetrate enemy defenses, destroy any major urban industrial area in the world, and return non-stop to the point of takeoff. This sweeping claim was an exaggeration. The realities of range and payload meant a B-36 would often need forward bases or careful planning to reach the most distant targets, but it captured the optimism of the time and the faith placed in America's long-range bombers. By September 1949, the House Armed Services Committee issued its final report exonerating Secretary Johnson, Secretary Symington, the Air Force, and Convair of the Navy's allegations. The revolt of the admirals subsided, though it left some bitterness. Over time, the Navy would channel its strategic ambitions into submarine-launched ballistic missiles, while the Air Force continued to invest in bombers and, soon, long-range missiles, laying the groundwork for the future nuclear triad. Amidst this debate, the Air Force continued to improve the B-36 design. Even as the B-36B was entering service, thoughts turned to enhancements to address speed and altitude performance. In 1949, Convair engineers experimented with adding jet engines to the platform. This led to the next major variant, the B-36D, which retained the 6 radial engines but gained extra jet propulsion. 2 streamlined pods were hung under the outer wing sections, each pod containing a pair of General Electric J47 turbojet engines. These jets could be turned on for extra thrust during takeoff, climb, or when a burst of speed was needed over enemy territory. The phrase 6 turning and 4 burning entered the lexicon to describe a B-36D in flight, 6 propellers turning and 4 jet engines burning fuel. With all engines at full power, the big bomber could finally push its top speed above 400 miles per hour, around 435 miles per hour in short bursts, significantly cutting into the speed advantage that jet fighters held. However, the jets were voracious fuel consumers. They were typically used sparingly, because running them continuously would dramatically shorten the B-36 range. In practice, pilots engaged the jet engines for takeoff and for high-altitude dashes, but cruised mostly on the more fuel-efficient piston engines. The addition of jets solved one problem but introduced others. The weight of the jet pods and the extra fuel needed for them increased the aircraft's gross weight and initially even reduced its maximum range, until larger fuel capacities were added. Still, the jet-augmented B-36D offered much improved climb rate and better survivability in hostile airspace. General LeMay and the Air Force publicly touted the improved performance figures of the jet-assisted Peacemaker, claiming ceilings of 50,000 feet and voicing confidence that the bomber could hit targets without being intercepted. LeMay even asserted that the B-36 could approach a target undetected until bombs were falling, a bold claim, given the rapid advances in radar and interceptor technology worldwide. As these developments were underway, the world continued to change. On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and by late that year Chinese forces had joined the Korean War. These events marked the end of President Truman's post-war defense austerity drive. American defense spending surged, benefiting the B-36 program among many others. Suddenly, funds were available to produce the megabombers, as well as to build new Navy carriers and other armaments. Significantly, the B-36 itself was never used in combat even during the Korean War. Smaller, older bombers like the B-29 carried out all the conventional bombing in that conflict, while the Peacemakers remained in the continental US as a strategic reserve. In 1951, however, SAC's B-36 did achieve a new milestone. President Truman approved the deployment of a handful of atomic bombs to Air Force custody, and SAC conducted training deployments of B-36 units to overseas bases. That spring and fall, small numbers of B-36 flew from Texas to airfields in England and Morocco, demonstrating the U.S. ability to position nuclear-capable bombers within direct striking range of Soviet territory. Only a half-dozen aircraft were involved and their stays were brief, but the message could not have escaped Moscow's attention. For the first time, the capital and key regions of the Soviet Union lay within the combat radius of American bombers. It was essentially a bluff. During the Berlin crisis a few years earlier, the United States had possessed only a handful of atomic bombs and none were stationed overseas. But the Soviets could not be certain of that. Altogether, 1951 was a year of vindication for the long-range bomber concept. Celebrated photojournalist Margaret Burke-White rhapsodized over the B-36 in a photo essay for Life magazine, flying aboard a Peacemaker at 40,000 feet to capture dramatic images. She described the sky at that altitude as an incredibly dark, luminous blue, and she photographed the sight of 6 white contrails streaming behind the bomber's engines. One of her photos showed a 55-foot-high maintenance scaffold used to reach the B-36 tail in a hangar, illustrating the sheer scale of the plane. Another image showed an aerial refueling, although, tellingly, it was a B-29 being refueled in that photo, since no B-36 was ever equipped for in-flight refueling. Despite experiments with many aircraft in the 1950s, the B-36 never gained an aerial refueling capability. It simply had such long range on its own that mid-air refueling was not prioritized for it. Burke-White's accompanying map depicted a ring of US bases around the Soviet Union from which bombers could strike, hinting at the globe-spanning reach of SAC's bomber force. In reality, the B-36 still relied on either forward bases or one-way mission profiles to hit the deepest interior of the USSR, but the psychological impact of its presence was significant. If one looked closely at Burke-White's photo essay, there were hints of change on the horizon. The bomber being refueled in her spread was a B-29 Superfortress, not a B-36. One of the aircraft she actually rode in was a sleek new Boeing B-47 Stratojet, its swept tail fin visible in a photo, a faster jet medium bomber that was just entering service. And on a strategy map, the B-36 was shown symbolically hunkered at home in the United States, while smaller icons, representing B-29s or B-50s, encircled the Soviet Union at bases in Europe, North Africa, and Asia. The implication was that while the Peacemaker was a potent deterrent, it was not routinely forward deployed. Other forces were also being used to encircle the USSR. Within the Air Force, even as the B-36 reached its peak numbers, planning was well underway for more advanced systems. The B-47 Stratojet, a jet medium bomber with nuclear capability, was entering operational units by 1951. More significantly, Boeing was developing the B-52 Stratofortress, a fully jet-powered intercontinental bomber that would eventually supplant the B-36. The advent of highly efficient jet engines and the parallel development of aerial refueling changed the game. The B-36, with its mixture of piston and jet engines, was something of an interim solution, albeit an impressive one. It provided the US a true intercontinental strike capability a few years before all jet bombers and ballistic missiles arrived to take over that role. Even before those new systems fully took over, the Air Force looked for stopgaps to keep the B-36 viable against improving defenses. One scheme would have equipped it with pilotless interceptor drones to fight off enemy fighters. Another idea was to carry a manned parasite fighter. The Air Force experimented with this concept using a prototype parasite fighter, the diminutive McDonnell XF-85 Goblin, which could be lowered and raised from a trapeze in a B-36 bomb bay. Trials in 1948 to 49, actually using a B-29 as a test mothership, showed how challenging it was to hook the tiny Goblin back in, and that project was cancelled. By 1953, this scheme evolved away from bomber defense and toward independent strike or reconnaissance. The B-36 would loiter outside enemy territory while an attached fighter dashed in to snap photographs or even deliver a smaller bomb. This idea, called the FECON, Fighter Conveyor, program, was actually tested and briefly deployed. A few Peacemakers were fitted with a trapeze mechanism to carry a modified Republic RF-84K Thunderflash jet fighter partially enclosed in the bomb bay. Once near the target, the B-36 could release the parasite jet, which would then fly off at high speed to conduct reconnaissance or attack, and afterward the fighter would rendezvous and hook back onto the trapeze to be lifted into the bomber for the return trip. While technically feasible, several mid-air captures and releases were successful. The system was clumsy and perilous. As soon as aerial refueling became more practical for fighters, the parasite fighter concept was abandoned. The Air Force also explored an even more futuristic concept, nuclear-powered flight. With nuclear reactors promising immense energy, some envisioned a bomber that could stay aloft for days or weeks without refueling. Under a project codenamed NEPA and later ANP, a B-36 was modified to test the idea. In 1955, one B-36H was converted into the NB-36H Crusader, essentially a flying reactor laboratory. The bomber's cockpit section was heavily rebuilt with lead and rubber shielding, including a foot-thick leaded glass windshield, and a small nuclear fission reactor was installed in the bomb bay. Between 1955 and 1957, this NB-36H made 47 test flights, with a reactor taken critical on many of them, though it never powered the plane's engines. The goal was to see how the radiation affected avionics and crew, and how a reactor might be integrated into an airframe. The NB-36HS experiments demonstrated the shielding challenges. It carried 11 tons of protective lead and still emitted radiation, and with improvements in jet range and the emergence of ICBMs, the notion of a nuclear-powered bomber was eventually shelved. Still, it was a remarkable chapter. A nuclear reactor flew in the belly of a B-36, showing the lengths to which engineers were willing to go in pursuit of extended range. As these experiments were underway, Convair continued to refine the design through successive production versions. After the jet-augmented B-36D, the company delivered the B-36F, with upgraded piston engines for better takeoff performance, and then the B-36H, the most numerous variant, featuring improved crew accommodations and radar systems. The final production model, the B-36J, arrived from late 1953 onward with strengthened landing gear and greater fuel capacity to extend its range. By mid-decade, nearly 400 Peacemakers had been delivered, equipping multiple SAC bomb wings across the country. In the mid-1950s, recognizing that many of the B-36 defensive guns and crew provisions might be of limited use against faster jet fighters and new anti-aircraft weapons, the Air Force instituted a weight reduction effort nicknamed Featherweight. This program, implemented in stages, sought to strip the bomber of non-essential weight and thereby improve its performance. Featherweight I removed all the gun turrets and their associated crew positions except the tail guns, reducing the crew from 15 to 9 and saving considerable weight. Featherweight 2 went further by removing the crew comfort amenities in the aft compartment, such as the galley and bunks, and other equipment not critical to bombing, again cutting weight. Featherweight 3 combined these measures and added additional fuel capacity in the wings, maximizing the range and altitude. Many of the earlier B-36 models were modified to one of the Featherweight standards, and all new-built B-36J aircraft came off the assembly line incorporating these changes. A late-production B-36J in the Featherweight 3 configuration had only a pair of radar-aimed 20mm cannon in the tail for defense, a reduced crew, extra wing fuel tanks, and an allowed maximum takeoff weight boosted to around 410,000 pounds. The reconnaissance role of the B-36 became increasingly prominent as the 1950s progressed. A significant portion of the fleet, designated RB-36, was devoted to long-range photo reconnaissance missions. These aircraft carried sophisticated camera equipment in one of their bomb bays, including panoramic cameras and even an onboard film processing darkroom for immediate development. In an RB-36, the crew complement could swell to 22 members, including photo officers and additional observers. The forward bomb bay was outfitted with a pressurized compartment to house up to 14 cameras and the technicians to operate them. The reconnaissance peacemakers would fly extremely high and far, peering into foreign territory from altitudes few fighters could reach at the time. On one test, an RB-36 flying at around 40,000 feet photographed a golf course on the ground, and in the developed image an individual golf ball was visible on a green. Such performance was remarkable in an era before satellites or modern spy planes. RB-36 crews often cruised at altitudes above 50,000 feet, well beyond the reach of 1950s era fighters, and one pilot even boasted of soaring to 58,000 feet on a mission. Indeed, until the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft came into service in the late 1950s, the RB-36 was the Air Force's primary means of high-altitude strategic reconnaissance. Crew members who flew these marathon missions recall both the confidence the aircraft gave them and the sobering realities of the nuclear age. Flying at extreme altitudes, B-36 crews often felt untouchable by enemy fighters of the early 1950s. There are recollections of Soviet MiG-15s and MiG-17s scrambling ineffectively far below peacemakers that were cruising well above their reach. American fighter pilots of that period similarly reported that the B-36 could fly higher than they could, making interception during training exercises extremely difficult. This altitude advantage was one of SAC's trump cards, but it was understood to be temporary. The Soviet Union, for its part, had been lacking a bomber with the B-36 reach. It would not deploy a comparable intercontinental bomber until 1956, when the Tupolev Tu-95 Bear, a large four-engine turboprop, entered service, offering similar range and altitude with somewhat higher speed. By that time, however, newer threats such as faster interceptors and the first surface-to-air missiles were beginning to appear, which promised to challenge even high-flying bombers. Strategic Air Command's war plans even assumed that B-36 missions might launch from forward bases in England, North Africa, Alaska, or the Pacific to reach distant targets, with some flights potentially being one-way. Veteran crewmen have recalled that while they were confident in their ability to fly to a target and deliver their weapon, they were far less confident about surviving after the bomb fell, both because the B-36 was not fast enough to escape the blast effects of a thermonuclear detonation and because of the improving enemy defenses. These fears were given credence in 1954, when B-36 participating in the Operation Castle hydrogen bomb tests were jolted by powerful shockwaves from the explosions. It was clear that dropping such a weapon might be as dangerous to the bomber crew as to the enemy. By the mid-1950s, it was apparent that the B-36 was a transitional aircraft, a titan born in the piston engine era that was being eclipsed by the jet age. The Air Force had already committed to the all-jet B-52 Stratofortress as its next intercontinental bomber. Convair made a last attempt to prolong its bomber line by proposing the YB-60, essentially a B-36 airframe fitted with 8 jet engines and swept wings. The YB-60 showed some promise in test flights, but it could not match the performance of the purpose-built B-52 and was not ordered into production. Thus, even as the B-36 reached peak operational service, its days were numbered. Still, the Peacemaker had a few more chapters in its active career. In 1955, SAC undertook its first full overseas deployment of a B-36 unit, sending a wing of Peacemakers to RAF Fairford in Britain and another to Anderson AFB on Guam as part of a rotational training and deterrence exercise. That same year, the B-36 had its Hollywood moment, starring in the feature film Strategic Air Command alongside actor and Air Force Reserve Brigadier General James Stewart. The movie's lavish aerial footage showcased the B-36's immense size and presence to the public. In one scene, Stewart's character, a baseball player turned SAC pilot, flies a B-36 through towering cloud formations, an impressive cinematic display of the Peacemaker in flight. Interestingly, in the final scene of that film, as Stewart's B-36 pilot is talking to a SAC general, a model of a B-52 can be seen on the general's desk, foreshadowing the transition underway. After 1955, the B-36 role was increasingly taken over by newer systems. The B-47 medium bombers were by then numerous, and the first B-52s were entering squadron service. President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration, following a defense doctrine known as the New Look, placed heavy emphasis on nuclear deterrence via a strong strategic bomber force, as well as the burgeoning missile force, to deter Soviet aggression while controlling defense costs. Strategic Air Command's bombers, first the B-36 and then the B-52, were at the heart of this strategy of massive retaliation. In the broader context of the Cold War, the B-36 marked the opening of a new strategic era. During the 1950s, the United States relied on long-range bombers as the primary means of deterring war, before the advent of a large intercontinental missile arsenal. At the same time, the other branches developed complementary nuclear capabilities. The U.S. Navy focused on Polaris missile submarines, and the Army, and later an independent Strategic Missile Command, developed land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. By the close of the decade, these elements formed the enduring nuclear triad of bombers, submarine-launched missiles, and land-based missiles. The B-36 Peacemaker had helped establish one leg of that triad and demonstrated the value of a credible long-range deterrent. Its tenure was relatively short, but it arrived at a pivotal juncture when its sheer presence and capability filled a gap and gave the United States strategic breathing space until newer technologies could assume the role. By 1956, B-52 Stratofortresses were rolling off Boeing's production lines in quantity, and SAC began phasing out its B-36 units. Bomber wings that had flown Peacemakers started converting to B-52s or disbanding. The writing was on the wall. The era of the gigantic piston-powered bomber was ending. The B-36, for all its size, was essentially obsolescent in the face of supersonic fighters and radar-guided missiles that were just over the horizon. Moreover, as thermonuclear weapons grew smaller and lighter, they could be carried by faster platforms. The Air Force gradually retired the Peacemaker fleet between 1956 and 1959. Nearly all B-36 were gone from operational units by the end of 1958. On February 12, 1959, the last B-36J in service, serial number 52 to 2827, nicknamed the City of Fort Worth, made a ceremonial final flight. It took off from Biggs AFB in Texas, flew one last time over Fort Worth, the city where it had been built, and landed at the nearby Amorn Carter Field. There it was handed over to the city of Fort Worth for static display as a monument. A few months later, on April 30th, 1959, another of the last B-36JS was flown from Davis-Monthan AFB in Arizona to Wright-Patterson AFB in Ohio. That aircraft would become the centerpiece exhibit at the new Air Force Museum. And with those final ferry flights, the era of the B-36 Peacemaker came to a quiet close. Over the span of its production from 1946 to 1954, Convair had built more than 380 of these giants. Now, barely a decade after the first had entered service, nearly all were already consigned to the scrap heap. At boneyards in the Arizona desert, the wings and tails of retired B-36 were sliced apart by cutting torches, yielding piles of aluminum alloy that would be recycled. The once proud Peacemaker fleet vanished with surprising swiftness, gone by the early 1960s save for a few examples earmarked for display. For a machine of such size and power, the B-36 operational life was surprisingly short and, from a combat perspective, uneventful. The aircraft never dropped a bomb in anger, never fired its cannon at an enemy plane. It was built to fight World War II, but arrived too late for that conflict. It stood guard through the early Cold War, but no great power war erupted during its watch. In a sense, the B-36's greatest missions were the ones it never had to fly in reality. Of course, the aircraft was not without troubles and tragedies along the way. Its sheer complexity and the demands placed on it led to numerous accidents. More than 30 B-36 were lost in crashes or serious incidents between 1949 and 1957. In 1950, a B-36 departing Alaska on a simulated nuclear strike mission ran into severe icing and engine trouble and became the first aircraft ever to jettison an atomic bomb, albeit a training device, in flight. The crew dumped the unarmed weapon off the northwest coast of Canada before bailing out of the stricken bomber. The bomb, which fortunately lacked its plutonium core but did contain conventional high explosives, detonated in midair over the ocean with a bright flash, becoming the first lost nuclear device of the Cold War. The B-36 wreckage was later found scattered in the remote coastal wilderness of British Columbia. In another calamitous episode, on September 1, 1952, a powerful tornado struck Carswell Air Force Base in Texas, where dozens of B-36 were parked outdoors. The storm damaged or destroyed a great many of the bombers, roughly two-thirds of SAC's entire B-36 fleet at that moment. In the aftermath, Emergency teams from Convair and the Air Force worked together to repair most of the aircraft over the ensuing months. Amazingly, all but a couple of the damaged B-36 were eventually restored to flight. One severely battered Peacemaker that could not be fully repaired was salvaged to create the NB-36H nuclear reactor testbed aircraft, and another was scrapped and later used as a ground target for a nuclear test. Thanks to this massive recovery effort, SAC's Peacemaker fleet was largely back to strength by mid-1953. The year 1953 brought its own tragedies. In February, a B-36H crashed during a landing approach at Goose Bay, Labrador, after a transoceanic flight. 2 of the 17 crew members aboard lost their lives. Then on the night of March 17, 1953, an RB-36 on a radar-evading training mission out of the Canary Islands veered off course in bad weather and fatally struck a hillside in Newfoundland, Canada. All 23 crew on that aircraft were killed, including Brigadier General Richard Ellsworth. In the wake of that accident, Rapid City Air Force Base in South Dakota was renamed Ellsworth Air Force Base to honor the fallen commander. In another incident in 1957, a B-36 accidentally dropped a Mk-17 hydrogen bomb near Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico when the weapon's harness malfunctioned during landing preparations. The huge bomb fell to the ground a few miles from the runway and exploded with a tremendous conventional blast. Its nuclear components were unarmed, thankfully. These and other incidents were kept secret at the time, only revealed decades later, highlighting the inherent risks of the strategic bombing mission in the nuclear age. Moreover, the Peacemaker structure contained a high percentage of magnesium alloys to save weight, which meant that when a crash did occur, its wreckage could ignite and burn with exceptional intensity, often leaving little behind, a propensity that earned the bomber the grim nickname Magnesium Overcast. Supporting a fleet of such complex aircraft was also a tremendous challenge for ground crews. Routine maintenance on the B-36 was a monumental task. Each aircraft had 6 large piston engines with a total of 336 spark plugs that fouled regularly, miles of wiring, dozens of hydraulic and pneumatic systems, and intricate remote control turrets. It was often said that for every hour a B-36 spent in the air, many dozens of man-hours were required on the ground to keep it flying. Engine changes, for example, were laborious and time-consuming. Much of the maintenance was performed outdoors, and crews were largely exposed to the elements while working on the giant plane, enduring searing heat on summer ramps, up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit or more, and numbing cold in winter, down to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit wind chills at some northern bases. Special engine shelters and docks were constructed to provide at least some cover during maintenance. At some bases, partial hangars with sliding doors and cutouts for the B-36 tall tail were used so that mechanics could work on the forward sections of the plane in heated space while the tail and wings protruded outside. Even with these measures, ground crews often had to endure harsh conditions. They risked heat exhaustion on sun-baked ramps in summer and frostbite on icy flight lines in winter, all to keep the giant bombers mission ready. The B-36 magnesium-rich airframe also meant that any fuel or oil fires could be especially hazardous. Ground personnel had to be vigilant about safety. Maintenance troops developed a kind of grim humor regarding the airplane's challenges. Convair had proudly called the B-36 the aluminum overcast for its vast, overhanging size and touted it as a long rifle giving SAC global reach. Airman Riley adopted the aluminum overcast moniker, and they adapted it into gallows humor about the plane's temperamental engines as well. Instead of 6 turning and 4 burning, a weary maintenance crew might joke that their B-36 had 2 turning, 2 burning, 2 smoking, 2 choking, and 2 more unaccounted for. Such jokes reflected the reality that keeping 10 large engines, 6 piston and 4 jet, running smoothly was a never-ending job. And yet, those very same crewmen took great pride in their mammoth aircraft and its mission. Many of the men, and a few women in support roles, who built, maintained, and flew the Peacemaker remember it with a mix of frustration and awe. It was a hard plane to love in some ways. It could be exhausting to fly and fickle to fix, but it also commanded respect by its sheer capabilities. The B-36 did what it was designed to do. It gave the United States truly intercontinental air power in the critical early years of the Cold War. In the end, almost all Peacemakers met an ignominious fate in scrapyards. After flying their last missions, they were sent to storage at places like Davis-Monthan AFB in Arizona, then cut up for metal. The speed with which they vanished was striking. Within a couple of years of retirement, the great majority were gone, melted down and recycled, leaving only memories and a few museum pieces as evidence that this mighty aircraft once existed. In retrospect, the Convair B-36 Peacemaker occupies a unique niche in aviation history. It It was an aircraft born out of one world war and then called upon to deter another, much more devastating conflict that thankfully never occurred. It remains a monumental chapter in the history of aviation and a testament to the men and women who designed, built, and flew this giant through some of the most tense years of the 20th century. Even now, decades later, the sight of a B-36 displayed in a museum, with its immense wings arching overhead, is a reminder of that extraordinary period. It speaks to the immense challenges faced and overcome by its creators and crew, and to a time when having such an aircraft at the ready was considered essential to preserving peace.